Hello, my name is Shane Coughlan, and I am the General Manager of the OpenChain project. What we do is we address open source license compliance. We have created a standard to explain how to do open source license compliance in a company effectively. In this talk, you'll find out about our standard, about how it has grown from a small collection of companies into many hundreds, and about the future of open source license compliance. Let's start at the beginning. When we're approaching something like open source compliance, we have so many moving pieces to deal with. At a very high level, we need to think about processes. What processes are important and effective when it comes to managing open source licenses? Then, when we want to fill out the processes, we need to address details. For example, what method of describing software, what method of talking about it is most effective? And then, further down in the stack of compliance, we need to consider things like tools. How do we automate aspects of license compliance? How do we make it faster, more efficient, and more accurate at the same time? OpenChain, as a project, is dealing with the very top. We're all about the processes. The OpenChain project has created the OpenChain specification. This is a standard that explains where processes should exist to make open source license compliance effective. Effective in licensing, effective in resource cost, and effective in speed. Let's dig into how and why we created a standard for open source license compliance. First of all, it's worth talking about the companies behind OpenChain. We have a huge international community. There are hundreds of companies involved. But at our heart, we have some companies in particular on our governing board. These companies provide funding for our project, and they provide strategic support in planning and execution. On this slide, you can see some of the companies on the board. These are 20 of the companies out of 21 that work with us. The 21st is a new company that will announce their presence very soon. From the 20 on this slide, you can very quickly see great diversity. Companies like Arm beside Microsoft, Toyota beside Google. The companies that are on our governing board come from all types of market spaces. And while they're all pretty large, they are very different types of companies, managed differently, different sizes. The only thing you can say in common is that they all use open source software, and they all want to make sure that aspects of it, like open source licensing, are effective. The reason that they're on the OpenChain board is because fundamentally, they're all facing the same challenge and have identified that the same solution works for them. Let's dig into this. The OpenChain project itself defines the key requirements of a quality open source license compliance program. It's all about what are the key things we need to do to make sure that license compliance works. When it comes to defining processes, there are many routes you can take. For example, you could outline where processes should exist, what those processes should contain, and how those processes should be managed. Or you could make large checklists to explain individual steps, and so on and so forth. The diversity is nearly endless. OpenChain, with so many companies from different areas on its board, took a holistic, overarching, long-term view on process management for open source compliance. The first fundamental is that we know it's important that any company of any size in any market can have access to great open source compliance. The second point is that we know the appropriate detail of processes is as varied as the company types and sizes. And the third point is that even with the diversity in play, there is something that is always the same. And that's what we call process inflection points. OpenChain, instead of telling a company every detail of what to do, clearly and concisely identifies where a company should have a process in place. In other words, it says at inbound, have a process here and here and here. Internally, have processes here and here, have training, have a policy. And externally, have processes here and here and here. Instead of telling people exactly what each process should contain, it instead identifies the point where we know a process should exist. And if a process exists, whether it's a detailed process or a lightweight process, the chance of catching the things that are necessary around open source license compliance are dramatically increased. In other words, if people put processes in the right place, and if they put the processes appropriate to them, the chance of errors in open source license compliance is dramatically removed. The idea of the OpenChain project is not about one company, though of course we are defining process points for one company. The idea is actually to address the supply chain. We have 20 or more companies involved in license compliance in bringing one product to market. Perhaps a chipset company will have a driver that is open source. Perhaps a company providing a board will have drivers for the board itself. Perhaps companies helping to build the finished product will provide additional software. Given the complexity of making one product, 20 or more companies involved in most products, it's important to have a way to make sure that company to company to company open source license compliance works. OpenChain does that because we define the inbound and outbound process points. And as all the companies in the supply chain become OpenChain conformant, naturally the supply chain itself benefits from their individual conformance. In other words, our goal is to link the companies which all have the key requirements of a quality open source license compliance program in place. We show that companies have adopted the OpenChain standard through a simple logo. You can see on the logo that OpenChain and a certain version of it has been adopted by that company for an open source license compliance program. Each version of OpenChain is equally valid. They're just different iterations of the specification over time. For example, version 1.0 came to market in October 2016. It was an effective, efficient standard for explaining open source license compliance. But as it went out around the world and as we got feedback, we gradually improved some points of the language. Some of the time we were simply making things clearer. Some of the time we were specifically making things easier to translate, and so on and so forth. We're at OpenChain 2.0 today, and that's the version of OpenChain that has entered the ISO international standardization process. I'll get to that in a minute. My main point is that companies can adopt OpenChain and have been doing so since October 2016. And these companies have a simple way to show that they have put in place the key requirements of a quality open source license compliance program. And by seeing the version they're using, you know exactly where their process points are and how those process points have been framed. Here's an example list of companies with publicly announced OpenChain conformant programs. You'll see that the companies here are just as diverse, in fact more diverse, than our governing board members. Everything from ethical banks in Myanmar through to parts of the British National Health Service have engaged with OpenChain and become conformant and made public announcements around it. Now, of course, more companies are OpenChain conformant and have not announced it for one reason or another, and more companies still are working on conformance today. The point in showing you this is to underline that this standard is suitable for companies of all sorts in all markets, precisely our goal. Now, OpenChain is an open source project. We don't make computer software, we make an international standard. But the way we do it, the openness and the collaboration, will be very familiar to people who work in open source. OpenChain is made by user companies for user companies. On our main mailing list, the center of our activity, we have thousands of people involved. We've got international work teams in areas like tooling and automotive collaborating on, well, making sure that OpenChain is understood and effectively communicated in their market space. We have regional work groups in countries like China, Japan, Korea. We have so much activity around the world, it's hard to define on one slide on its own. The point is, many hundreds of companies represented by thousands of people are working with OpenChain, not just using it, but part of it, part of making sure that the reference material is great, part of making sure it's translated and available, and part of making sure that there is support for new companies and new people to engage with our community, to answer their questions, to bring our knowledge to them, to receive their knowledge in return, and to assist them with OpenChain conformance if that's their goal and if that's what they need. Now, OpenChain as a standard can be met in many different ways. Just like any standard, you can, for example, download the specification itself, read it, and make sure that you meet all of the requirements. That is, well, self-certification, a common method of meeting standards. We provide that method. You can get the standard off our website, but we also provide additional support to make it even easier to engage with and understand OpenChain. On this slide, you can see our self-certification questionnaire. This questionnaire is designed to take the standard, make it into a format of yes/no questions, and then a person can access those questions and quickly, with yes/no answers, understand if they have already got the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program, and where they answer no, understand exactly where they need to put effort and resources to make sure they do. This self-certification questionnaire, as with all of the project material, is hosted via our website. And as with all of the project material, it's available free of charge. You just access it and fill it out in private until you're ready to announce conformance, or at your option, not announce conformance, just use it and keep it private. The self-certification questionnaire is a fascinating tool. Initially, when we made it, we thought people would use it for conformance. And that's true of about 50% of the users. What is interesting is that another 50% are not working on conformance today, but they are using our questionnaire as a health check to see how their internal processes are running and where they can apply resources for improvement in either fidelity or efficiency. We're delighted to see all use cases in play here. Everything we do to contribute towards more effective open source compliance is a win. Now, our website has a lot of material, and the reason is simple. We made a standard, and we made, for instance, a self-certification questionnaire, yes/no questions to check if you meet the standard. But when it comes to answering these questions, remember they're about processes. People often ask, okay, I need to put a process here. What should the process look like? If you'll recall, I said earlier in this talk that we are very careful not to dictate what the process content is. The reason is simple. Companies of all sizes in all markets must be able to use this standard. So we don't dictate the content of a process, but we have a substantial reference library to give examples. We've got company case studies. We have reference training slides and policy material. We've got books on issues like mergers and acquisitions, and we have translations into a wide variety of languages. In other words, we provide a huge amount of material to help answer questions about, well, what could my process look like? Without being prescriptive, we can assist. A lot of this material some of the key material, I should say, is available directly on our website. For example, the case studies, or our supplier education leaflet, or our reference training slides. Just go to the website and get it. But we have so much reference material, hundreds and hundreds of documents, that we actually store the entire library on GitHub. You can click through the various categories like checklists or guides and find the material you want, often in many different languages. The idea here is to make sure reference material is freely available to anyone at any time. And indeed, as part of this, we license the reference material under CC0, effectively public domain. So you can take, for example, our supplier education leaflet, and you can make it into a new document. And that's fine. You don't have to credit anyone, you don't have to link back, you just take it and use it. The intent here is that companies can incorporate reference material into their existing path, their existing documentation, their existing processes, with as few limitations as possible. And of course, we're equally delighted for people to take our reference material and make it into completely new documents. Perhaps a consultancy wants to make a new training service. Perhaps a large multinational wants to take something like checklists and guides and put them onto an education platform. Excellent. Do so. It's freely available. Every reference document we have is available there. In fact, the only things we don't license as public domain are the specification itself, for obvious reasons, because a specification needs to remain coherent and singular, and case studies, where we're actually saying X company did Y. The case study, of course, has to keep its integrity to make sure the company's representation is accurate. But the vast majority of reference material, whether it's about policies, guides, checklists, flowcharts, it's all there for you to take and edit and share in any way you want. And we're delighted to see it happen all around the world. Now I'm going to touch on a more commercial side of things. The OpenChain project is absolutely non-commercial. We're part of the Linux Foundation, a huge organization supporting open source across almost 400 projects. One of those projects is Linux. One of those projects is us. And in between, my goodness, we've got everything from cloud native through to energy projects. But of course, when people are addressing something like open source license compliance and they're thinking about process management, they often have questions, perhaps legal questions that are appropriate for a law firm to engage with, or perhaps service questions that are appropriate for a service provider. The OpenChain project has collaborated with and worked with many organizations around the world to make sure that support infrastructure is in place. Our partner program covers a great many geographies, and it covers an awful lot of the use cases you might have when you think, I need vendor support. As a user company, I want support in this area to save time. Now, we have all types of law firms in our partner program. Some of these law firms are global and some are local. All of them deeply understand open source and understand the OpenChain specification. They've all been engaged with us for quite a while. And we know with confidence that if you approach them, they can assist you with your questions around open source license compliance and OpenChain. In the same way, we've got service providers in our partner program. They, again, have great knowledge around open source, and they have knowledge around OpenChain, and they're positioned to work effectively with us and to work effectively with you when needed. Then, of course, we have vendors who provide proprietary tooling, such as FOSS-ID and Synopsys, and we've got third-party certifiers like PwC and DevZud. I'm going to talk a little bit more about third-party certification in just a moment. So, we talked about OpenChain self-certification, and that's a very, very important part of our project. In fact, we describe that as the core of our project. We want to make sure that companies all over the world can self-certify to the standard, and they can do that on their own terms, in their own time, in their own way. But in some market spaces, and in some company sizes, people want third-party certification, where a third party actually provides the certification process. We have, at the moment, 2 global third-party certifiers. One is PwC, a firm that is, of course, renowned for things like accounting and auditing. Their German office is coordinating their global third-party certification, but the certification is available everywhere. And we have TÜV, a certifier who was originally based in Germany, but it's their Japanese office maintaining our third-party certification, and they provide services globally too. In areas like automotive or infrastructure, it can be quite important to have third-party certification for reasons related to regulations or, for instance, intercompany expectations. And that's why we're delighted to have third-party certification available. Though, and I stress this, the core of the project is always self-certification, and it's very important to remember that while there are partners like law firms or service providers or vendors, fundamentally everything you need to pick up, use, and deploy the OpenChain standard is available on our website free of charge. If you need help, you can get it. Okay, so OpenChain as an international standard. This is the exciting part. It should be clear to you by now that OpenChain is a successful de facto industry standard. It's been out in the market since 2016, and many hundreds of companies are engaged with it. Some are conformant, some are working on conformance, and some companies are using OpenChain for other things apart from conformance. This standard is very successful. It has a lot of momentum. But of course, at some point, every de facto standard needs to consider becoming a formal standard, entering into those processes that have, for many decades, guided companies and governments in dealing with approaches to managing anything, whether it's quality, like ISO 14001, or functional safety, like ISO 26262. Formal international standards provide the backbone of what we need to do and how we need to do it in terms of process management and in terms of execution. In other words, it's obvious that formal international standardization is perfectly suited for something like the OpenChain specification. And we know that. We worked in partnership with something called the Joint Development Foundation, an organization designed to help specifications become formal standards, to submit into ISO, or more specifically, ISO IEC JTC 1, Joint Technical Committee 1. We went through something called the pass transposition process, and that's a process explicitly designed to take a standard from de facto to formal. We started the process in April, and we actually concluded it in late September. If you're familiar with standardization, that might sound a little bit quick, because standards are often suggested, edited, and deployed in a 50 to 60 month cycle through things like ISO national committees. In our case, that wasn't necessary. The standard had been edited and published and iterated before in the market de facto standard. So the pass transposition process is quick and effective for taking de facto standards and making them formal. And that's where we are at. OpenChain is an approved international standard. We are currently numbered DIS 5230. DIS stands for Draft International Standard. And we are pending formal publication. Because we completed our standardization with an approval vote in late September, and because ISO has a process where they publish within 6 weeks, we expect at the latest to have been published by November 10th. And we're preparing all sorts of interesting PR for that. But the point is not really PR. The point is, after publication in ISO, there is a wonderfully simple way for companies to include OpenChain in their negotiations with suppliers, in their sales pitches, and their internal management. Put simply, OpenChain will have an ISO IEC number, and you can simply include that number in your normal sales and procurement activity, whether negotiations, contracts, or advertising material. Obviously, it's easier for things like procurement departments to understand and engage with an ISO number than trying to engage with a de facto standard, such as OpenChain called OpenChain. It's the same standard, but it is in a format that is easier to ingest and deploy. In other words, just like our very own standard itself, our new terminology, our new number, makes it even easier to use the international standard for open source license compliance. Now, given that we are an ISO IEC international standard, and you'll have that number in your hands very, very soon, how about those conformance options? I mentioned self-certification, I mentioned third-party certification. Let's dig into that just a bit, because this is the most important thing. You're going to be asking your supplier companies to be OpenChain conformant, and your customer companies are going to be asking you to be OpenChain conformant. How do you do it? Well, freedom of choice is one of the most important things we've got around the OpenChain project, and we've worked to make sure you have the maximum freedom of choice in adopting this standard. There are three fundamental ways that people can adopt an international standard. The first is self-certification. I've already talked about that a little bit. The second is independent compliance assessment, or just independent assessment. And the third is third-party certification. When it comes to self-certification, the heart of our project, you can use our online web app or a downloadable checklist with yes/no questions to see if your program today meets all the requirements of the International Standard for Open Source Compliance. And every time you answer no to a question, you know that's where you should put resources in making your compliance more effective. It's simple, it's neat, and it's available for free on our website. This slide shows the direct link to the online self-certification questionnaire. You can use that in confidence and in private to assess your current adherence to the International Standard for Open Source License Compliance. This is where we recommend everyone starts, and it gives them a good mental model of where they are today and helps inform what they should do next. Maybe they will improve internal processes. Maybe they'll get third-party help. This helps you decide what you need to do. Now, independent compliance assessment is where you do self-certification, you do the questionnaire, but a third party has a look at what you're doing and can make some suggestions. They can tell you, yes, we think this works, or no, we don't think that works, and explain why. In other words, it's a friendly, though vendor-based, way to get a little bit of help in your self-certification. It's also a way, if you're dealing with your suppliers, to make sure that your suppliers' decisions look appropriate as per an independent assessment. This is available by way of example from law firms or service providers around the world. And you saw earlier, our official partner program has quite a lot of them listed and quite a lot of geographic coverage. Now, third-party certification, the final method, is something quite large compared to the other two. Third-party certification is where someone else actually does the certification process for you. They adapt your company processes and they allocate resources. This is where a third party takes explicit responsibility for carrying your company into conformance. That's where you will have a company like PwC or TÜV assist end-to-end to make sure that you can be OpenChain conformant. If I was to explain these three choices in the simplest manner, I'd say self-certification is ideal for contextualizing where you are, and it's ideal for the majority of companies to become OpenChain conformant. It allows them to look at yes/no questions, wherever they answer no, to put in an improved or new process, and that's it. Independent assessment is useful if you don't really have the knowledge in-house to fill out processes. Or, for example, you have the knowledge, but you want to double check. The independent assessment can help a great deal there. Third-party certification is a much more heavy lift, where someone takes responsibility for certifying you. Though, of course, that's a more expensive thing to do than either of the other two options. However, it can be very important in regulation-heavy industries. For example, in certain areas of the automotive supply chain, it may be normal or even required to have third-party certification. And that's why it's there. And that's why we're glad to have partners who can provide that when you need it. The OpenChain industry standard, in summary, defines the key requirements of a quality open source compliance program. It identifies the inflection points where you need to do something, because we've identified those inflection points based on real-world knowledge and real-world experience. This standard is extremely effective in reducing risk and reducing resource cost and reducing time to market. So many mistakes are avoided. So much time in remediation is removed. And so much energy that would be wasted is put into more productive areas, like actually making and deploying your product. Now, when it comes to meeting the international standard for open source license compliance, you have various options. Self-certification is the heart and is always the key. Third-party certification is for regulation-heavy industries and where people need end-to-end assistance. And independent assessment is somewhere in between, where you're able to where you're able to independently assess yourself, you self-certify yourself. But an organization can look at what you've done and provide suggestions and ideas. Whatever choice you make, the key takeaway is that there is an international standard for open source license compliance. It's available for you today, and there's plenty of support if you need it when adopting the standard. But of course, self-certification is right there, the reference material is right there, and a vibrant community of user companies just like you are right there. And maybe that's the most important point to take away from this talk. Because OpenChain was created by user companies and is designed for user companies, and because it's entirely based on practical experience, it's a standard that works. It really works effectively. No waste, no avenues that are not productive, just straight to the point, the maximum effectiveness for open source license compliance. Here's what you do, here's where you do it, and here's the support you need. It's ready today. And the user companies collaborating around OpenChain are far more than a dry handful of companies. As I said, hundreds of companies, country teams all over, and everyone facing the same challenges as you, and everyone solving the challenges through sharing knowledge. We have had the most remarkable efficiency in collaborating together in getting this done. And that's why it works. We're also well positioned to help in other areas. For example, people often ask us, well, can you assist in security or export control or other fields? Our answer is that OpenChain is focused on open source license compliance. But of course, companies using OpenChain are well positioned automatically in areas like security. The reason is simple. If you can identify the software you're using, then you've identified areas where risk exists or does not exist. And that's why often we have dialogue with security professionals, governments, and so on. Indeed, we're keeping all that dialogue open and considering in the future how any gap that exists between open source and effective security is covered. That's a discussion for another day. Today was all about explaining to you how OpenChain, the international standard for open source license compliance, works and why it's important and how you can engage with it. This slide shows you exactly what you can do to get started. There's our website, there's our self-certification questionnaire. Just go there, engage, and you're ready to go. It's that simple. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for not just listening to me today, but having curiosity around the OpenChain standard for open source license compliance. Now is the right time. It's in market, it's an international standard, and it's ready to support you in dealing with open source license compliance in a way that is consistent, effective, and resource low. You can visit our website. You can email me at any time. I'm very happy to work with you, and especially to introduce you to your peers in your local geography. I appreciate all of the energy and commitment that you and others have in using open source effectively. Thank you very much.